In the spring of 1586, in a quiet manor house near Chipping Campden, a maid sweeping the corridor stumbled upon a small folded paper that had slipped beneath a door. She picked it up, thinking it was an ordinary note, perhaps a shopping list or a stray message from a guest. But when she read the first line, she froze. She was 16, poor, illiterate until the previous year, and yet that moment, accidental, undeserved, almost absurd in its simplicity, would place her at the center of the most dangerous political conspiracy of Elizabethan England. The maid's name was Anne Vaughn, and although history rarely mentions her, one could argue that she changed the direction of the British crown with a single decision. She walked straight to her mistress and handed over the letter, instead of burning it. That act, impulsive and instinctive, would expose one of the largest assassination plots of the 16th century. It would lead to torture chambers, coded messages, royal paranoia, and a queen terrified for her life. And it would end with the death of a woman who had once been crowned queen at the age of 6 days old. But to understand why a lost letter mattered so much, we must begin decades earlier, with a kingdom divided, a rival queen imprisoned, and a set of men who believed destiny itself could be rewritten with the tip of a dagger. England in the mid-1500s was a land of trembling uncertainty. King Henry VIII had shattered the religious unity of Britain by breaking from Rome, and in his wake came tension, rebellion, plots, and paranoia. When his daughter Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, the country was exhausted by religious whiplash, Catholic one reign, Protestant the next. Elizabeth, cautious, brilliant, and stubborn, restored Protestantism and tried to steady the nation. But she had a problem: a living Catholic rival with a better claim to some eyes. Her name was Mary Stuart, known to us today as Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been Queen of Scotland as a baby. She had married a French prince, become Queen of France, and then returned widowed to Scotland at 18. Her reign there had crumbled under scandal and rebellion, and in 1568 she fled across the border seeking refuge from her English cousin, Elizabeth. It was the worst decision of her life. Elizabeth, suspicious of Mary's popularity among Catholics, saw her not as a guest, but as a threat, a potential figurehead for rebellion. So instead of welcoming her, she ordered her held under a form of elegant imprisonment. Mansions instead of dungeons, banquets instead of chains, but imprisonment nonetheless. 19 years passed. 19 years of letters, schemes, prayers, and despair. Through all of it, Mary insisted she was the rightful Queen of England, and many powerful men, Catholic nobles, foreign kings, and desperate exiles, agreed. They believed England would never be whole until Elizabeth was removed and Mary crowned. Among those men was Anthony Babington, young, wealthy, idealistic, and dangerously convinced that God had chosen him to restore the Catholic faith in England. The note Anne Vaughn found was part of his plan. Anne was the sort of girl history forgets, a servant, a nobody in the eyes of the elite. But what made her unusual was her curiosity. Her mistress, Lady Fortescue, a kind-hearted widow, allowed Anne to attend lessons given to her own daughters. Anne soaked in every word, reading, writing, even a little Latin. In a world where most servant girls never touched a book, Anne became something quietly extraordinary. Which is why on that April morning when the letter slid beneath the guest room door of a visiting gentleman, Anne could read it. And reading it changed everything. The letter was brief, written in an elegant hand. "The Queen shall fall, and her liberator shall rise. Our task is holy, our allies numerous. Await instructions, for the sake of Mary." Anne did not understand its full meaning, but she understood enough. Someone wanted to harm Queen Elizabeth. She brought it trembling to Lady Fortescue, who in turn passed it to a family friend, a man whose name was already whispered with a mix of fear and fascination, Sir Francis Walsingham.
Elizabeth's spy master. Walsingham was the architect of a secret war. A war of ink instead of armies, spies instead of soldiers, coded messages instead of swords. He believed Catholics across Europe were plotting to overthrow Elizabeth, and he devoted his life to rooting out conspirators. Many disliked him. Some called him paranoid, cold, even cruel. But he was brilliant, relentless, and often right. When Lady Fortescue sent word describing the strange letter her maid had found, Walsingham acted immediately. He asked to speak to Anne. It was the first time she had ever stood in front of a figure of national power. She was terrified, but Walsingham was not unkind. He sat her down, poured her water, and asked her every detail she could recall. The handwriting, the room, the man who had slept there. Anne remembered the man well. A handsome young gentleman with soft eyes and an almost too earnest smile. His name had been Anthony Babington. Walsingham did not show it, but he knew that name. Babington had been on his list of potential conspirators for months. Now he had proof the young noble was involved in something far more dangerous than youthful defiance. And Anne Vaughn, 16, unnoticed, unimportant, had just opened the door to one of the greatest espionage operations in British history. Walsingham put Babington under discreet surveillance. He watched who he met, what he wrote, where he traveled. He planted spies in inns, used cryptographers to intercept messages, and paid informants from London to Derbyshire. But Babington was not merely a conspirator. He was a romantic. He believed God had chosen him to rescue Mary and restore England's faith. He idolized chivalry, saw himself as a knight reborn in an age that had forgotten honor. And Mary, isolated, desperate, responded. For 19 years she had been trapped, her every letter monitored, her every visitor watched. She had been queen once, now she was a prisoner. And Babington's admiration, his promises, his reverence, these warmed the cold loneliness of captivity. So when he sent her a message proposing a plan to free her and assassinate Elizabeth, she did not reject it. She wrote back. That one letter, that single slip of desperation, would seal her fate. But she did not know that every message she sent was being intercepted, decoded, and delivered to Walsingham before it reached its intended recipient. She had been speaking to Babington through a spy. Mary had been kept at Chartley Hall under the watch of Sir Amias Paulet, a strict Puritan who believed any sympathy for Mary was a sin. He was uncompromising, loyal to Elizabeth, and determined to prevent Mary from spreading influence. But Mary had her own supporters. A secret system had been installed to smuggle her letters in and out. Messages hidden in beer barrels, wrapped in wax, sealed inside wooden stoppers, delivered by a trusted brewer. Mary believed the code was unbreakable. She believed Paulet was unaware. She believed Babington's messages were private. She was wrong on all three counts. Walsingham's cryptographer Thomas Philippes had cracked the code. Not only were the letters readable, they were being copied before delivery. Every word Mary wrote, every hope, every fear, every plan arrived on Walsingham's desk. And then, one summer evening in July 1586, Philippes carried a newly decoded letter into Walsingham's chamber, his usually calm face pale with shock.
Mary had done it. She had approved the assassination. Walsingham now had what he had waited nearly 20 years for, proof that Mary, Queen of Scots, had endorsed a plot to kill Elizabeth. All he needed was for Babington to reveal the names of his fellow conspirators, and Walsingham knew exactly how to make him do that. He forged a postscript, in Mary's own cipher, asking Babington to name every man involved. Babington, flattered and thrilled,
wrote back immediately with a full list. It was over, but he did not know it yet. On August 14, 1586, the trap closed. Babington and his men were rounded up. Some attempted to flee, others tried to hide. A few fought back. One shot himself, but survived long enough to be questioned. Babington was captured hiding in the forest of St. John's Wood, disguised poorly and trembling with fear. He confessed quickly. Elizabeth's government, furious and afraid, moved swiftly. Babington and his conspirators were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the brutal punishment for treason. On the first day of execution, the London crowds gathered, curious and bloodthirsty, but the spectacle was so horrific, men disemboweled alive, limbs torn off, that Elizabeth herself ordered the remaining executions to be done more mercifully. The conspirators died, but the woman they had wanted to rescue still lived. Not for long. Mary was moved to Fotheringhay Castle, a grim fortress in Northamptonshire. She went not as queen, but as a prisoner charged with treason, the only monarch in British history to be tried by her own cousin's government. The trial was a formality. Her letters were revealed. Her coded approval of the assassination was read aloud. Mary denied everything, insisting the letters were forged or tampered with, but the evidence, real and manufactured, was overwhelming. The commissioners declared her guilty. Elizabeth hesitated for weeks before signing the death warrant. She feared outrage from Catholic Europe. She feared damnation. She feared being remembered as a queen who killed another queen. But she signed. On February 8, 1587, Mary Stuart was led to the execution chamber, dressed in black, beneath which she wore crimson, the color of martyrdom. Witnesses later wrote that she met death with more dignity than anyone present expected. Her final words were a prayer. The axe fell, and the rival to the English throne was gone. And the maid who had found the first clue? She faded back into obscurity, unrewarded, unrecognized, but responsible in her small way for the unraveling of a conspiracy that shook the kingdom. Anne Vaughn lived to the age of 71. She died in a village where no one knew she had once changed the fate of a crown. But history remembers what she accidentally prevented: the assassination of Elizabeth I, the collapse of the Protestant succession, and perhaps the end of England as we know it. The Babington Plot, though foiled, left England trembling. For ordinary people, from London merchants to Yorkshire farmers, it confirmed a fear that had haunted the nation for decades. The Queen could be killed at any moment. Rumors swept across London that Spain was preparing a great fleet, that Catholic nobles were arming in secret, that the Pope had blessed the rebellion, that Mary's death would unleash foreign invasion.
The truth was a mix of all of these. Europe watched the events with fascination and fury. In the taverns of Seville, men spoke openly that the heretic Queen of England would not survive the year. In Paris, whispers spread that England would soon return to the true faith. In Scotland, memories of Mary's brief glory stirred resentment. And in England's own streets, citizens looked more suspiciously than ever at neighbors whose faith differed from their own. Walsingham's intelligence network, already sprawling, doubled in intensity. Secret watchers patrolled ports, diplomats were shadowed, priests were tracked, and coded letters were intercepted and deciphered. Yet for all the state machinery, one fact remained quietly astonishing. The entire plot had been uncovered because of a dropped letter, and a curious maid who chose not to hide what she found. Anne Vaughn did not know any of this. She was back to polishing floors and helping her mistress with household accounts. But in Whitehall, her name appeared in several private memos, not for fame, not for reward, but as a reminder of how fragile the kingdom truly was. Had she been less curious, had she been unable to read, had she decided it was none of her business, history may have been rewritten entirely. Elizabeth I was never straightforward in emotion. She was a queen who delighted in speeches, pageantry, poetry, but recoiled from personal decisions that weighed on her conscience. Mary's death was one such decision. When the counselors brought the death warrant to her, Elizabeth hesitated for days. She once even threw the document angrily at her secretary, shouting, "She is my cousin, my equal. Would you have me spill royal blood?" But she signed in the end. And after Mary was executed, Elizabeth performed a masterstroke of political theater. She pretended she had never meant for the execution to occur. She wept publicly. She blamed her counselors. She imprisoned her trusted secretary, William Davidson, for misinterpreting her wishes. She refused to speak of Mary for months. But privately, late at night, she told Walsingham, "We have rid ourselves of one danger, but I fear we have invited 100 more." She was right. Within months, the greatest threat England had ever faced would rise on the horizon: the Spanish Armada. Mary's execution enraged King Philip II of Spain, already Elizabeth's enemy, but now driven by a personal vendetta. Philip believed Mary had died a martyr. Elizabeth was a tyrant, and England needed deliverance. Throughout Catholic Europe, Mary's death became a rallying cry. Pamphlets, paintings, and sermons portrayed her as a sainted queen slaughtered by heretic cruelty. Philip began assembling a vast naval force, 130 ships, nearly 20,000 soldiers, 8,000 sailors, what would be known as La Armada Invencible. And in the war rooms of Madrid, the Spanish king repeated a chilling conviction: England must fall. It begins with the death of their queen. He meant Elizabeth. He meant a foreign invasion. He meant to finish what Babington and Mary had begun. But before the Armada sailed, England faced another internal crisis, one that would bring Anne Vaughn unexpectedly back into the wider story. In late 1587, Lady Fortescue and her household were invited to London to stay with relatives. Anne found herself for the first time walking through the capital, past cobbled alleys, crowded markets, the tower's looming walls, until they reached the River Thames. There, amid the bustle, Anne saw a sight that stopped her breath. A man in irons, thin and bruised, was being escorted by guards to a small boat. Crowds murmured that he was a courier caught carrying coded messages to Scotland, messages thought to be intended for foreign Catholic agents. Anne stared. Something about the man seemed familiar. Not his face, but the way he carried himself, cautious and secretive. That evening, unable to sleep, she spoke to Lady Fortescue.
"Madam, may I tell you something strange?" Lady Fortescue, forever patient, nodded. Anne admitted she recognized the courier from the manor he had once visited in the company of Babington months before the plot was exposed. The next day, Lady Fortescue sent a message to Walsingham. When Walsingham's response arrived, it was simple: "Bring me the girl." Anne, trembling, was brought to Whitehall Palace. She expected stern interrogation, perhaps even punishment for meddling, but Walsingham greeted her with surprising warmth. "Anne," he said, "you have a talent for noticing what others ignore." She blushed. "I only remember faces, sir." "Few people do," Walsingham replied. "Most remember only what they wish to." He questioned her gently. What had she seen? When had she seen him last? Did Babington speak to him alone? Did any other gentleman accompany them? Anne answered as best she could. Her memory was sharp, astonishingly so. She recalled the colors of their cloaks, the sigils on their rings, who brought their horses, even which servant carried their letters. Walsingham listened intently. When the questioning concluded, he dismissed her, but paused, then added, "You may not realize it, Anne, but you have served your country twice." Anne returned to Lady Fortescue with her heart thudding in her chest. She did not understand how she had served her country at all. She simply remembered what she saw. But Walsingham understood perfectly. The courier Anne had recognized was part of a broader network of Catholic messengers. Her recollection gave the spymaster enough information to unravel another chain of communication that stretched from London to Edinburgh and then to continental Europe. Anne did not know it, but once again she had prevented dangerous information from leaving England. By the spring of 1588, England knew war was coming. Church bells tolled with grim urgency. Militias drilled in village greens. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons. Elizabeth delivered one of her most famous speeches at Tilbury, declaring, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." But behind the scenes, the threat of internal treachery terrified her as much as foreign invasion. She knew that if Spanish forces landed, English Catholics might rise in rebellion. Walsingham intensified surveillance. The Privy Council issued orders to arrest suspicious persons across the country. And in a quiet chamber of Whitehall, Walsingham wrote a private note, never meant for the public, that contained a single line. Had that girl not found the letter, Babington's work would have succeeded. We would not be preparing for battle. We would be preparing for burial. When the Spanish Armada finally approached the English coast in July 1588, England's fate hung by a thread. The nation held its breath. Fire ships were launched. Cannons roared. Galleons scattered. Storms battered the Spanish fleet. English captains, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, fought with cunning and speed. When the battle was over, the seemingly invincible Armada lay shattered. Only half the ships made it home. The rest were wrecked on rocks or sunk by storms. England had survived, and the victory changed the destiny of Europe. Protestant England emerged stronger than ever. Spanish dominance faded. Elizabeth's legend grew. But hidden beneath the grand strategy, beneath the ships and storms and speeches, was the truth that few knew. The war should have begun with the assassination of Elizabeth. That had been the original plan. Babington's daggers were meant to strike long before Spanish sails appeared. And if not for a maid's curiosity, they might have. Years passed. Elizabeth grew older. Walsingham died in 1590, exhausted by a lifetime of vigilance. Anne Vaughn married a carpenter, moved to a modest cottage outside Gloucester, and raised 3 children. She never sought recognition. She never wrote her story. But people remembered her. When travelers later passed through her village, they sometimes whispered that the quiet woman with the gentle smile had once spoken to queens and spies. Children were told she had once caught a traitor with her eyes. Older villagers insisted she had saved the kingdom, though she always denied it. Anne died peacefully in 1632, long after Elizabeth's reign had ended, long after Mary's tragic legacy had turned into legend. She left behind no letters, no memoirs, no portrait. But she left behind something far greater, a moment of choice on an ordinary morning in an ordinary corridor that changed the history of Britain.